Bom dia a todos. Welcome to H2HC. I'm very pleased to be here again. I am a little bit nervous that I am starting the day, and my presentation is not about hacking. It is about security. I do hope that I provide you an interesting perspective, and that this is the content of my presentation is worthy of H2HC. This is, I think, the third or fourth time that I've been to this conference. Very pleased to be here again. Rodrigo and Felipe, thank you very much for the invitation. So, a little bit about who I am, and then a little bit about why I'm here. So, as Felipe mentioned, I work at Microsoft. I've been there since 1990, so that's 20 plus years at this point. 3 different careers. I worked in consumer software. I worked in server software. I worked on IIS, the web server. 4, 5, and 6. The official security team about 8 years ago. But while I worked on, all my career at Microsoft, I've been engaged in security. When I worked on Microsoft Money, that was my first trip to Brazil back in 1995. On Money, that was the day when SSL in France was only allowed to have 40 bits of encryption. When I worked on IIS, that was, if you remember NIMDA and Code Red, that was a little bit of an introduction to security for me. Today I work on the group that is focused, it's the centralized team within Microsoft that is focused on security engineering, security response, security policy, critical infrastructure, and engagement of the security researcher community. That's the Trustworthy Computing Security Group. It's a single team within Microsoft that has responsibility for the engineering policy for all products. Every product that ships from Microsoft must meet the security bar, or it doesn't ship. And every product that has a security vulnerability must meet certain standards when issuing a security update. A little bit more about this in a bit. I started my career on consumer software and in testing. I moved to program management. And then when I joined the security team, I focused on outreach to the security community. Then I ran the MSRC, the Security Response Center. I did that for 2 years. That 2 years of Patch Tuesday and of getting incoming security vulnerability reports and managing the updates, that's enough. 2 years was plenty. Today, and it was plenty, especially because the focus there is really on fixing vulnerabilities. And the focus from an engineering perspective is on improving the quality of the products. What I realized, though, was that although Microsoft products are much better today than they were 10 years ago, much more secure, much more robust, and although Microsoft has issued many security updates, the average customer may not be significantly more safe. Attackers go to the low-hanging fruit, the easiest thing to break. It's not Microsoft anymore, but there's still plenty that's on a Windows machine that is easy to compromise.
So my focus today is on engaging the whole ecosystem security providers, governments, protection providers, citizens, policymakers, to see how do we affect change that does make people safer. Because today, no one company, no one individual, no one government can deliver the kinds of protections needed for today's threats. So I'm focused on end-to-end trust and on collective defense. So why am I here?
Well, the answer to that really is twofold. One, I'm here to give a presentation, and I'm going to talk about a number of things. I'm going to talk about my perceptions, my thoughts about Brazil, and about the state of security in Brazil. I'm going to talk about a couple of frameworks that I think will be helpful as you think about the problem. And I'm going to stop and I'm going to ask and I'm going to listen. Because the last thing I want is for me to come across as a North American that doesn't really understand Brazil, but that comes to tell you what you should do. I want to listen. I want to ask you. I want to get input from you on, did I accurately assess the issues here? Did I identify some things that need to be worked on? So that's one part of why I'm here. The other part of why I'm here is that I volunteered to focus on Brazil. You know, there wasn't anybody else on my team that wanted to focus on Brazil, if you can believe that, huh? I'm kidding, just a little. But Brazil is a very important market to Microsoft. And over the last 4 or 5 years, I've been coming to Brazil, and my understanding of the country and of the people has changed dramatically. So I'm here because Microsoft is committed to helping Brazil. I'm here because I have a wealth of experience from product development and security and risk analysis and risk management. And I want to see how I can apply those skills in Brazil to help raise the level of computer security in Brazil, and hopefully along the way also convince you that Microsoft has excellent security engineering practices and that the Microsoft products actually are very secure. And maybe you end up using Windows 7 instead of Linux. I don't know, maybe. So when I first came to Brazil, this was kind of my impressions. And this is kind of the impression that, you know, an average North American might get. You know, if you're not very aware, well, you know about Carnival, you know about Bossa Nova, and you know about soccer. You don't even know about futebol, you know about soccer. And of course you know about the praia, and you know, these slides will go out, and so I said, you know about bathing suits. What I really mean is you know about how beautiful the Brazilian women are, huh? And maybe you've heard about favelas. And if you've been here once before, you maybe have been to a churrascaria, and maybe you know about how popular online banking is, and maybe you know about cybercrime. But some of the things you might not know, though, is that Brazil is actually the 7th largest IT market worldwide. It's the 6th largest country in terms of PC shipments. You know, it's almost 200 million citizens. And it's the 3rd in online time per user. You know, there's only 40 million Brazilians that are online, but they spend a lot of time online. And I don't know exactly where they spend that. I don't know if that's on Facebook or if that's on Orkut or where that is, but there's a lot of time online. The 5th largest cell phone market, and this I think is an old statistic. I think just last week it was published that there are actually more cell phones in Brazil than there are citizens in Brazil. So that's over 190 at this point. The one in the middle there is one that was a surprise to me, was that the 2nd largest worldwide in the number of companies. And this, I think, is really demonstrated in how Brazilians approach, it's all about business here, but it's in a very good way. And the other thing that's surprising is that, there are now, I've looked at Brazil since I was in the university back in the 80s. And now there are Brazilian companies that are a clothing company that's actually moving to Texas to set up a manufacturing facility in Texas. The largest food processing companies in the world are Brazilian. And they now are branching out into North America, into the U.S. And the last two, the number of active internet users continues to grow dramatically. It's very rapid growth. And the number of broadband users is growing as well, and will continue to grow with the emphasis on expanding broadband adoption. Telebras is now recreated with the mandate to go expand broadband access in 100 more cities and to get 40 million more Brazilians online with a fast connection. And so, from the first time I came to Brazil, and I'm in the taxi going out to Guarulhos, and I see the motorcycles passing by. Like, wow, this is a really different country. And the first couple of times I came to the airport and I came to the Hilton in Morumbi. And I don't really get much of a flavor of Brazil. But over the last years, I've been to Salvador, I've been to Campinas, I've been to Rio and Sao Paulo and Brasilia, and I've gotten a flavor of the country. This is a fantastic country. I love Brazil. It's just an amazing country. The people, I have never seen or been exposed to more friendly and more welcoming people. Smart and hardworking, and proud and still humble at the same time, and which is a very strong and good combination. The culture here, it's a diverse society, and it has a rich history. Some of the things that I've learned over the last years are Jorge Amado. It's like, what a wonderful storyteller. And to have him tell about the sandbars in Salvador and the coffee plantations, that was a fantastic experience for me. And that's literature that a normal North American isn't going to get. G. Cavalcanti is a fantastic artist that I learned about last time I was in São Paulo at the art museum up on Avenida Paulista. This is a land of opportunity as well. It's a huge country. It's rich in natural resources. It's rich in people. And the government here works as well. I was in Rio last week, and I'm walking along the beach, and here is a public display of the fundamental rights of, it was the United Nations Charter on individual rights. And it was in a public space, and here are the 20 or 30 principles. And I thought that was astounding to have that in a public space, reinforcing the rule of law, reinforcing the principles upon which this country is built. Some of the other things that I've found, I was in Buenos Aires 2 weeks ago, and Buenos Aires is a wonderful, beautiful city. And they had the free night of museums. So all the art museums in the city were open, and were free. And they were open until 3 a.m. So I showed up to the Modern Art Museum about midnight, and there's a line all the way around the building. Just fantastic. And I'm standing there in line, and I said to my girlfriend, you know, if we were in Brazil, there would be someone out there selling cafezinho. There would be someone out there selling cheese. There would be someone out there selling fruit. There was nobody there. And then I told that story to a Brazilian, and they said, yeah, and not only that, but there would be people in line who would be selling their spot in line. So that, I think, is a wonderful example of the inventiveness, the creativity, the hard work that goes into Brazil. And, you know, things, the thing that is, that I appreciate the most about Brazil is that things really work. You know, Brazil is maybe not perfect, but things work very well here. And not only does it work, but it works in a Brazilian style. You know, you're true to the principles, you're pleasant about it, and you get things done in a very Brazilian way. So this is one of my favorite pictures. This is the picture that I discovered from de Cavalcanti at the Sao Paulo Art Museum. And this was painted in 1930, and it still is as representative of Brazilian culture as today, I think, as it was then. So I talked about two reasons why I'm here today. Well, one of them is to give a presentation. The other is really about longer-term goals. I'd like to see if I can contribute to reducing the threat environment here in Brazil. Not one company, not one group of people, not one organization can solve today's problems. So I want to see if I can bring my experience to help build capacity in either government or in industry. I'm happy to be if I'm allowed, if anyone sees value in it, to be a consultant, to be a trusted advisor. How are some of the problems that I've faced? Do those apply here in Brazil? And as I said, also help foster awareness of the Microsoft security excellence. So with that as a little bit of background, I want to transition into what I see as some of the issues in Brazil from a security perspective. The statistics I highlighted earlier certainly show that there are more users and faster connections today than before. And I would assert, I say that today this average security awareness of the internet users is lower than it was years ago. Now in this room, the average security awareness continues to go up every year. But across a broad population, if you go add 40 million new internet users next year or over the next couple of years, the average security awareness might not be as high as the first 40 million. You know, the threats continue to become more sophisticated and faster. And on the defense side, the bad guys have been talking to each other for a long time. The good guys are talking to each other a bit more, but still there's room for improvement there. I presented at You Shot the Sheriff just a little while ago this year. You may have seen this slide there. I use this because I think on a single slide it's an easy representation of some of the many different issues that enter into security. I use the analogy of a balloon that's filled with air. And if you squeeze it down here, the air goes somewhere else. And I think security is similar to that you have all of these problems, and if you just focus on this problem or on this problem, the problems just move somewhere else. The challenge is that you need to focus on all of these at the same time, and that's nearly impossible.
So you can see here that, at the top, security, awareness, and education. It's always a need for more. Along to the left, the legal and regulatory environment. I was at IC Cyber earlier this year in Brasilia, and the police are really challenged to address this.
The Brazilian law says that the police must investigate a crime in the jurisdiction where the crime happens. Now, if the criminal happens to be in the Northeast or in the Southeast, but the crime happens in Brasilia, then the criminals are not in the place where the crime happened, and investigation becomes a very challenging issue. Today the internet doesn't have any boundaries, and it's easy access to Brazil for criminals from other countries. The guys at the banks told me that most of the malware is written in Spain. Continuing along, the engineering effort that goes into malware is very sophisticated compared to what it was a couple of years ago. And it's very quick. Defenses come along, and the malicious software is re-engineered to work around that. In Brazil, there's a high percentage of online banking, and in fact, there's rapid adoption of new technologies. And so often in the US as well as in Brazil, consumers think of the benefit that comes from the new technology, and they don't always think about the security implications. It's always a challenge to keep antivirus signatures up to date, and it's always a challenge to stay up to date and current with patches. This is a problem everywhere in the world. It's a problem here in Brazil. So that's just around staying safe and being protected. If you think about this from a governmental perspective, if you think about the challenges that ministers have, security is only one of the things that they need to think about. They need to think about climate change. They need to think about protecting the rainforest. They need to think about other legal and regulatory. They need to think about the condition of infrastructure. And so security is just a small one dimension of the challenges that they need to face. And this is particularly true if you think about what's coming up in 2014 or 2016. Cybersecurity is clearly a critical aspect of hosting the World Cup or the Olympics, but it's not the only one that policymakers need to worry about. So the combination of those kinds of things in terms of lead to a very high percentage of malware found on machines in Brazil. This is data that comes from the Microsoft Security Intelligence Report, version 9 that was released not too long ago. And you can see that Brazil is a very popular destination, not just for tourists that want to go to the beach, but also for people that write malware. And some more statistics in terms of worldwide infections and where Brazil ranks. And also in terms of botnets and infections. So there is a whole page on the Microsoft.com/SIR site that is dedicated to Brazil. So if you want, you can go. I have a link at the end of the presentation if you want to spend a little more time looking at that. So, and all of that put together the changes in the consumer, the changes in users, the changes in the threat environment, the infection statistics. All of that leads to greater infection. And it's very common today. One of the other challenges, I talked about that challenge of only focusing on one area and moving the problem, squeeze the balloon here and the air moves somewhere else. The other problem is it's very easy to talk about the different kind of attacks. Well, that was cyber warfare, that was espionage, or that was cyber crime. And the dividing line between those different kinds of attacks, it's hard to tell when it moves from cyber crime to cyber warfare or cyber espionage. And in fact, in some cases, in many cases, it doesn't matter because it's the same tactics. It's the same thing that a bad guy puts together a phishing email with a piece of code that actually executes on the machine. And whether that's targeted at a specific user to exfiltrate or to capture company secrets or price list, or whether that's to attack a government installation, it's the same tactics and the same mechanisms that are used. So the same protections apply regardless of which label you put on it. So with that as background, I'm going to talk about a couple of things that I think may be helpful as we talk about the problem of security, to help break the problem down into small enough pieces so that you can actually make progress. The first thing that I want to talk about is this notion of maturity models. Now, Microsoft has talked about this for quite some time in terms of IT infrastructure, that some companies manage their IT environment in a very basic way, and some are very advanced and very sophisticated in how they manage their IT infrastructure. And you can see a maturity model and the benefits that you get as you move up the maturity curve. I think this applies equally well in the security domain. And I think that this is important because you need to plan and you need to try to do the things that are most appropriate depending on what your stage of development is. And everyone wants to be the star baseball player or football player, but you have to do the things that are appropriate at that time. And so I outlined that there's basic, standardized, rationalized, and dynamic. And in a basic environment, you're essentially reactive. You don't really have much of a plan. As you become more familiar with this and more experienced, you have more processes in place. The other aspect that I would highlight is that along with that notion of maturity, there's this idea of managing the whole threat life cycle. There are things that you should do at the beginning to protect. Oftentimes, companies or individuals find that their first interaction with computer security is after they've had a problem. And that tends to be in the basic category. Oh my gosh, I have a problem. Now what do I do about it? There's enough information out there about computer security that you can actually plan. You can prepare yourself. If you're an enterprise, the first thing that you need to do is you need to know what machines are on your network and what should they have access to and who's connecting. If you can't do that, your ability to actually defend your network and protect your assets is pretty limited. And then once you've been able to identify those, then you need to monitor them and actually know what goes on your network. There's a lot of work that goes into those phases before you ever get to the place about, oh my gosh, I've been compromised and then I need to go and do something. I would highlight down here in the respond aspect that as I worked on the MSRC, the Security Response Center, the thing that I learned was most important was about communication, was about making sure that you had accurate information and you communicated that to stakeholders. Because in the absence of accurate information, people are going to assume the worst and make things up. And then, of course, there's the recover phase that says, now that I've dealt with this, I've cleaned it up, how do I go back and update my policies and procedures? How do I go back and fix things? And as a framework for how do you attack the problems of computer security or computer defense, combining these two, which is managing the whole threat lifecycle and taking those actions that are appropriate at your stage of development, that's a pretty powerful that's a pretty powerful combination. So that's one framework that I think might be helpful as you think about what are the next steps that I need to go and take. I have another framework, collective defense. Scott Charney, who's the vice president for the Trustworthy Computing Group, authored a white paper in September that talked about collective defense. And the basic idea, the basic idea behind Scott Charney's white paper was that security issues have gotten to the point where we need new tools and new ways of thinking about it in order to continue to make progress. There's been a lot of talk about applying a public health model to the internet, that you can think about computer infections much like you can think about infections in the physical world, about diseases, and that there's some applicability of that public health model to the internet. You know, and there are a lot of anti-botnet initiatives around the world. And I have some pointers to those at the end of the deck. Walled garden or quarantine. You know, this is where an ISP will know whether a machine is infected or not infected and will allow it on the internet or not, depending upon, and there are a lot of different approaches here. I know that in Australia, if the ISP knows the machine is infected, they simply turn off the modem. And then the customer has to call up on the phone, and they say you're infected, and you have to get cleaned up, and then I'll let you back on the internet. Yeah, that works in Australia. In Uruguay, it's similar. But in Brazil, that doesn't necessarily work. And this goes back to, and it doesn't work because the Brazilian law says if it's not explicitly forbidden, then it's allowed. And this is one of the things that I was talking about. That's a beautiful principle. That's a wonderful thing. It means you need to work a little bit harder because not any of the ISPs today have terms of use that say if your machine is infected, you can't get on the internet. So that wouldn't, a walled garden or a quarantine approach doesn't really work in Brazil. But I do think that there are some ideas from this notion of public health model that are applicable in Brazil. When I think about the problem dimension, I think about it really, and the parallel from public health does work here. I think about it in terms of the population. I can think about users and devices. Are they healthy? Are they infected? What's the state? How do you educate the users about what good hygiene is, about what proper care is? And how do you give them easy to understand solutions to help themselves? And then I think about interactions. So in a public health space, educating the population is the first step to reducing infection. Similarly in the computer space, I think. In the public health space, managing the interactions, like cover your mouth, if you sneeze, wash your hands. Everyone's seen those because those are interactions between people that spread infections. There's similar kinds of interactions where if there were more transparency, that would be helpful. So, and it works on both sides. On the server side, and the server wants to know if the client coming in is actually protected and is actually clean. The client at the same time wants to know, is that the real server that I'm connecting to? And how secure is that server, and how well do they manage their the data that I supply to them? And then, of course, there's the environment. If you think about it from a public health perspective, it could be around making sure that the water is clean. If you think about it from a computer security, you could think about it in terms of how do you make it so that the network is not hostile. You know, like if you come to a hacker conference, the network is not particularly friendly. So using that as kind of a framework, thinking about it from population or from users, and thinking about it from interactions, and thinking about it from the environment. I then think about collective defense in terms of, well, there are some things that citizens can do, there are some things that enterprises can do, there are some things that governments can do. And again, going back to the balloon, if you just squeeze in one area, the air goes somewhere else. All of these things need to happen, maybe not at the same time, but they have to happen in parallel for progress to be made, for cybersecurity to see significant improvement. The other aspect that I'll highlight here is that collective defense really has two elements to it. There's the proactive. Here are all the things that one can do in advance to help make it a more secure environment. The thing I learned, though, is that issues will happen, and there will be problems. And so collective defense also means that all of these other players are going to be involved if there's an incident. If you remember back to a couple of years ago, an airplane crashed into the Hudson River in New York City after takeoff. And that news spread around the world very quickly. It's an interesting story about how that news spread, because it wasn't about CNN or the equivalent. If there was something that happened in Brazil, it isn't going to you're not going to learn about it on Globo News. What happened was there was a guy on a ferry crossing from New Jersey to New York who had an iPhone, who saw the plane crash, took a picture, and then tweeted about it. And so within 5 minutes, that message goes out to his friends, that then gets sent to their friends, and finally CNN and the New York Times hear about it. There are all these other players that are going to be involved in any kind of an incident. So if you think about 2014 or 2016, and you have any responsibility for those issues, you're going to have to think about how do you engage the media in a productive dialogue to make sure that message is accurately heard. How are you going to engage private sector? Because it is a collaboration between citizens and government and the private sector. So now I get to the point in my talk where here are some of the things that are on my worry list. A worry list, when I was shipping software and you get close to the end of the release, you're monitoring the number of bugs and the number of check-ins and how close are you to finished on a certain feature. But writing software is not a complete science. There's a little bit of art that goes into that. And so it was a worry list. Well, I don't really know if it's right, but let's put that on the list of things that we might want to just keep an eye on. And so here are the things that are on my worry list as I think about security, cybersecurity in Brazil. Growing online transactions. A year from now, 2 years, 3 years, 4 years from now, so much of the daily life will be online. Not everything may be a high-value transaction, but how do we go and solve that problem so that those online transactions are secure? Today in Brazil, online banking, the banks have solved this problem by using a browser plugin. I think Rodrigo told me there was going to be a talk on this later today or tomorrow. That is a solution, but that only applies to banking transactions. How do you go and make sure that the rest of the transactions are going to be secure? I'm sure someone in here is running Firesheep today, right? How do you help the rest of those 40 million new users understand about that? So another thing that's on my list is about uneven growth, and this kind of I think mirrors economic development, uneven growth across the country of Brazil. As I think about it from a computer perspective, it's about how do you ensure, or what things can you do to help security keep pace with the innovation? Because if it's not, then it's just the new features. The number of new features grows faster than security awareness or security engineering for new software or security response. This is particularly important, I think, and relevant because I know that it's always the weakest link that gets compromised. So from a defender's perspective, I have to go fix every software vulnerability in Windows or in Office. The attacker only needs to find one in order to win. And for security, it's the same thing. The weakest link is the one that's going to be compromised. And they're all, the weakest links are not too hard to find. And I think that the uneven growth is also applicable back to that maturity model that I was talking about. You want to make sure that you deal with the basics first. Go figure out how you're going to inventory all the machines, or go figure out how you're going to do the simple things before you worry about the advanced techniques for protection. Another thing that's on my worry list is the RIC, the National Identity Card, the Registry Individuals Civil. You're familiar? You know what I'm talking about? So that this will be available starting in December for a broad set of the population. It has biometrics, it has your fingerprints, it has 2 chips on it, one for contact, one for contactless. I think this is a fantastic thing. It will help deliver government services in an efficient way. At the same time, there are some things that I worry about a little bit. You know, if you go and look in Germany, Germany has a national identity card. Austria has a national identity card as well. You know, in Austria, part of the problem is that everyone has one and 4 people use it. I mean, that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but, you know, if you go and spend all that money, you want to make sure that people use it. You want to make sure that people use it for online transactions. People use it for voting. People use it for public benefits, for health care. And yet, also, if you look to Germany, you go, Germans have a national identity card, and I can't wait for CCC this year in December, because there have been presentations over the last number of years about problems where you could actually read this, where you don't need the PIN, and so while there are significant benefits to RIC, there are also some costs and some issues around that. And how exactly do you balance the benefits, the security, the benefits to society with the security issues and the privacy issues? And then, of course, there's broadband. You know, if you're going to go and wire 100 more cities with high-speed access and add 40 million new users, are you just giving the bad guys big fat pipes to go and attack Brazilians? I also think about maybe there's an opportunity there. Can we make it so that walled gardens might be possible, so that you could quarantine users? It's potentially interesting. Over the last 4 years, I've been coming to Brazil. I've come and I've talked at Fiespa, at the Day of Security. I've talked at Sikigov I've attended You Shot the Sheriff and H2HC numerous times. But always my attendance is I come to Brazil and then I leave again. Today I am focused on Brazil, and here are some of the things that I'm going to, that I hope to focus on. It would be interesting for me to hear from you, are these things that are important? Are these things that are worthwhile to go focus on? I want to work with the Malware Protection Center in Redmond and with the Internet Explorer team and the Windows Live team to make sure that we have the best coverage for Brazilian malware and Brazilian malicious URLs. I want to work with the federal police that are focused on RIC, and I want to bring the expertise that Microsoft has in interacting with other governments around the world and see what other lessons could be learned and how could those be applied in a Brazilian way to the challenges that you face. Is there a way that I can help with critical infrastructure protection? Is there a way that I can help with ensuring that the World Cup and that the Olympics are successful from a cybersecurity perspective? Last time I was here, there were some guys in the Army that talked to me about a new cyber defense center that will be built in the Army. Is there expertise that I can help apply? And this is another area where I think the maturity model is particularly useful. Make sure the basics are done before you go and focus solely on the advanced cyber war techniques. I don't know very much about the software development environment here in Brazil. Microsoft has 10 years of practice, of experience with secure engineering. Translating the Security Development Lifecycle book into Portuguese is a first step. What other things might be helpful in terms of making sure that the applications that run on the Windows platform are more secure? And one of the things I didn't talk about was that I actually helped create the Blue Hat Conference, which is Microsoft's internal hacker conference. We've now done 10 of them. Not quite 10 years, it's about 5 years worth of, or 6 years worth of conferences. And we will do a small version of that in Sao Paulo, hopefully in April, in collaboration with the security team at Fiesp. So using the Fiesp auditorium to connect the security experts and the business decision makers within Brazilian industry with the hacker population, to foster a dialogue and to ensure that they understand the needs and the perspectives that each brings. I'd be happy for you to tell me that here's another thing you should focus on, Andrew. Here's another opportunity to contribute to cybersecurity in Brazil. And then I have some questions for you, because I don't want to appear as the arrogant and uninformed North American that comes in and says, I know exactly what you need to do. So is my worry list too long? Are those things already taken care of and don't worry about it? Is it incomplete? What else should be on there? And similarly for the future investments. So I'm happy to take questions at this time, or please find me over today or tomorrow. I'll be around. With that, I have finished my official presentation. If there are questions, I'd be happy to take them.
Se alguém quiser perguntar em português, eu traduzo para ele, tá? Fica tranquilo.
And if there aren't any questions, then I will just highlight that here are some links. At the bottom, it's some of the worldwide initiatives on anti-botnets, and you can see that it's in the U.S., it's in Japan, and Europe as well, and also the link to the Security Intelligence Report. So, muito obrigado. Thank you very much.